We're so excited to have some of our colleagues from the Connecticut Digital Archive here. Greg Colati is the director of the Digital Preservation Repository Program, as well as the head of the Connecticut Digital Archive, a statewide preservation-oriented digital repository service for libraries, archives, and museums and memory institutions. Mr. Colati has more than 20 years of experience in archives, cultural heritage institutions. He is currently an adjunct professor at the University of Connecticut's Department of Digital Media and Design and has taught courses in archives management, digital repositories at Simmons University, the University of Denver, and the Society of American Archives. Greg's current research focuses on connecting digital libraries and cultural heritage education, machine learning, and handwritten recognition in historical repositories, and preserving non-traditional forms of scholarly expression. So that sounds very similar to what Trevor just talked about, some of the same issues. Michael is also with us. Michael is a repository manager for Connecticut Digital Archive at the University of Connecticut Library. Michael coordinates with the CTDA partner institutions across the state of Connecticut to provide training and support using CTDA to preserve and make discoverable cultural heritage material from a diverse range of collections. Prior to this role, Michael served as a social science and data librarian at San Diego University with a focus on developing quantitative library skills for students through data visualization, data analysis, and data analysis approaches. Michael previously was at the University of Connecticut Library in various roles and was the co-founder of the Connecticut Digital Archive. Michael is well known for his work in geospace literacy efforts, with nearly 2 decades of experience working with students and faculty on geospatial data and mapping projects, instruction, and research. Michael has taken extensive PhD level courses in geography at the University of Connecticut, has a Master in Library and Information Science from Kent State University, yay, Ohio, and a BA from Geography from the University of Cincinnati, another great Ohio institution. I think we have some, I don't know if they're here today, but we have some folks that we work with regularly from both of those institutions. And just a little more about the Connecticut Digital Archive in Context project is a call for critical reflection and action based on acknowledging the power and inherently political act of documenting histories that provide a privileged status to archival objects and the people they represent. Any interested person or group is welcome to participate in the Connecticut Digital Archive in Context. And I'll go ahead and turn it over to Greg and Michael to tell you more about their project.
Well, thanks so much. I want to welcome everyone to our talk, which we're calling Escaping Our Fishbowl. But I wanted to say, now, Michael, aren't you an Ohio native as well as someone who went to school in Ohio?
That is true. Georgetown, Ohio is hometown. So welcome, everyone.
So that's great. Our plan today is to speak for about 30 minutes and then open the floor to discussion because well, you're welcome to post questions in the chat as we go along. We'll address them and others during the question period. Like I say, a more complete explanation of our work is available on the CTDA and Context website, and the URL is available there on this slide and also at the end of the slide deck. My colleague, Michael Howser, is a repository manager at the CTDA, but Michael has been working at the CTDA for all of 1 week, and he was not part of the original research we're reporting on today, but as you've been told, he was part of the original development group of the CTDA and its core ideas during his first stint at UConn. We're here for a couple reasons. First, we want to tell you about some of the work we're doing to learn how to make digital preservation systems more accessible and useful to what we tend to call non-customary, or what are often called underdocumented groups and individuals. Our second purpose, though, is to learn from you. We want to know what your ideas are about the ideas we bring up. We want to know what you've tried and what has worked and not worked, as we continue to gather information on this subject of expanding participation in digital repositories. So I encourage you again to participate in the discussion as much as you can, as much as you'd like. As Trevor Owen said, I in the keynote, which I think was fabulous, preservation is more than software, and we'd like to expand on that and sort of turn it a little bit, and say that preservation is more than process, but process has a large effect on what gets preserved and how it is described and presented. So preservation does not happen in a vacuum, and it exists within a culture. And we want to understand the cultural decisions we make for ourselves and for others when we make preservation decisions. And then we ask this question, who should or could be making those decisions about what to preserve, how to preserve it, and how to talk about those things? And so you will see in this presentation how we discovered some of these questions and some of the answers of these questions as we studied the DPLA hubs, of which we were a part of that network, and our own CTDA members. And as I said, Michael Howser is the repository manager at the CTDA. And after a whole week, he's been doing a great job getting back up to speed. Michael.
All right. So a little bit about the Connecticut Digital Archive. Once again, Greg and I were the co-founders of the Digital Archive, so it's great to be back on the team. But who we are, we're a unit within the Yukon Library, and as Greg likes to often say, we're not grant funded as the core operation of the system. We are based on thinking of a long-term preservation mindset of the system, right? So we have 2 full-time staff, you're looking at them. We also have 2 project staff that have helped us with research along the way as well. And then there's more than just us, right? There's IT infrastructure support and a variety of metadata support across the library. We bring in people as needed, not only within the library, but across the state of Connecticut as well. We were founded in 2013, so we're coming up on our 10-year anniversary with just 19,000 objects, which at that time seemed a lot. Now we're looking at millions of objects, 3.2 million objects, and growing by the day. We're looking at 85 plus institutional members, 200 plus content managers across the state. And once again, it's a preservation-oriented repository. So what do we do? And Greg kind of talked already a little bit about this, but thinking about what our purpose is really the technology, the infrastructure to manage, maintain, and disseminate those digital collections. We're focused on the preservation side of it, and then get into great conversations about how to display and make accessible and visualize, enabling other systems, right? We support members by providing resources, training, and collaborative opportunities. We go to them, they come to us, we virtually go to them as well. So a lot of options across the state here. And advise potential applicants about the CTDA's programs, refer them to alternatives if we do not have something already in-house to assist them, and really connect to that broader umbrella, broader network that we're part of, right? The cultural heritage coalitions like the DPLA hub that we are. We also work with Islandora as our sort of our core technology stack and the Islandora Foundation, and then looking at the broader statewide digital initiatives. So this is why you're here today, is to talk a bit about the CTDA in Context project, and I'm going to turn it over to Greg to talk a bit about this initiative that we have at the Connecticut Digital Archive.
Yes, thanks, Michael. The purpose of CTDA in Context is, well, boils down to 3 things. We want to break down traditional power structures, inspire change, encourage broader conversations, and enable communities. Some of these aspirations may be unsettling to traditional organizational structures, which tend to support white social, economic, and political outlooks. This isn't surprising, at least in New England, since historical and memory organizations were often created to celebrate the success of white European society over what they considered the untamed and savage wilderness. Over time, many of these organizations that are members of the CTDA have broadened their missions, but still tend to work within a white European epistemology or worldview of how you describe content, of how you organize content, of how you collect content, and how you steward content. CTDA in context is about making systemic changes in how we preserve digital culture, how it's organized, described, and presented in ways that support the creators first, and that can be interpreted in different ways by different people. A little bit of background on the, whoops. That's it, Mike, thank you. You'll move the slides along, right?
Yes.
I'm hitting the button on my keyboard and going like, nothing's happening. The origins of CTDA in context go back to the summer of 2020, where we had a undergraduate intern from Mount Holyoke College who was very interested in archives and the concept of power structures in memory. She did a lot of good preliminary work, and then over a course of almost a year, we had internal discussions to understand and research the landscape of digital cultural heritage. At first, we had this idea that, oh, we would support collecting and other things about gathering content. But as we thought about it, we said, well, the CTDA doesn't actually gather or collect anything. We don't own anything. All of our members own content, and it's up to them what they collect and preserve. And we thought we would look at then, what are the things that we do? All right, and we looked at our systems, which were organized essentially according to white European worldviews. The metadata vocabularies that we connected people to were the very standard Library of Congress and Art and Architecture Thesaurus, and nothing that connected people to Indigenous or LGBTQ or any sort of what we would have called at the time alternative ways to describe or organizing content. So we said, all right, here's a systemic problem. Our systems and the way we do things are focused on a certain worldview. How can we open that up? But first, we needed to understand ourselves a little better. So over the summer of 2021, we did a self-examination of both the CTDA and analysis of our peers in the DPLA Hub network. We released our CTDA in contact white paper in fall of 21. And since then, we have done some things like introduce new policies on participation, and we'll talk about those in a little bit. We're starting a partnership with this California Digital Library and University of California in Irvine to expand our research. They're doing some research in community archives, and we're looking at how we can lower the barriers to entry to places like community archives. We'll talk about that a little bit later. And now we're sort of furthering our research and our outreach. So if we go on to the next slide, this is something that we used as a thought experiment to help us think, right? And this is the story, I don't know if you've heard it, David Foster Wallace's commencement address some years ago about the two young fish, and they meet an older fish and it says, morning boys, how's the water? And the fish swim on for a bit, and one of them says, what the hell is water, right? And what David Foster Wallace is trying to remind us of is that sometimes the most obvious important realities are the ones that are hardest to see and talk about because they fade into the background of our lives and don't get thought about. When we began thinking about making the CTDA more multicultural, we decided we needed to find out on what were our core assumptions based. What things weren't we thinking about? What was the water in which we were swimming? And how did these assumptions influence the things we did and with whom we did them? We wanted to know if we shared these assumptions with other organizations like us, most specifically other DPLA hubs, right? We had this hypothesis once we started thinking about it, that the CTDA and the DPLA hubs were essentially monocultural in their infrastructures and in how they communicated, but not necessarily in their content. And we're trying to separate the content from the systems that help people manage and make available their content. Because even when, like us, they make a commitment to attracting and working with underrepresented community groups, we thought that our worldviews, and especially the way we constructed our knowledge systems and our presentation systems, were dominated by white Western thinking. So we embarked on this journey of self-reflection by looking at ourselves, our members, and our colleagues in the Hub network. So today we're going to present some of those discoveries, not using a strict methodology of social science, but in a way that is a little bit more anecdotal and personal, and we hope more accessible. So as we examined DPLA Hub websites, we encountered some problems. First of all, many of the websites, including our own, were poorly designed and hard to navigate. It was hard to find information if you didn't already know what you were looking for. Another problem was that information on their websites, including our own, and we are not pointing fingers at anyone but ourselves, often use technical jargon that would be difficult for a newcomer to understand. And of course, since many DPLA hubs, like the CTDA, were often understaffed and had their websites put together by student interns or different people at different times, information on the websites often contradicted themselves. And so we were thinking, this raised the question, is poor design of a website and lack of clearly displayed information a barrier to entry? And our answer is, of course it is. Michael, why don't you go on a little bit and get into the more details?
So as part of this project, a survey was conducted of hubs across the country. And we had a total of 14 out of the 27 hubs responded to the survey. And as you can see here in the graphic, and really this was an opportunity for us to ask some of these questions to not only self-reflect on the CTDA, but to understand our other hubs, finding some of the things that we were wrangling with in our thought process here. So what we've found is, in one of the questions we were looking at is the number of partners or members that each of these hubs was working with. And you can see sort of the breakdown here. The majority of hubs are looking at less than 50 members that responded to the survey. But then it's evenly split after that, right? So we've got hubs that are managing up to 200 and 300 members, hubs managing 100 to 200 member organizations, and then hubs also with 50 to 100. So a wide range, and we're CTDAs in that 50 to 100 slice of the pie here. And the size of those hubs really do vary considerably. So when we look at that side, but then think about, well, what's another way to think of this? The cost to participate to the hub, right? So is there a fee? Is there some kind of financial hurdle to get over in order to become a content contributor to that hub in that particular place? So 79% of those that were surveyed that responded are free to be part of their hub system. And 21%, or 3 of the respondents of the hub systems, do have some fees attached to them. So that sort of asks the question, is that another barrier of entry, right? The cost to join the hub network, is that reducing the number of potential contributors as well? So not surprising, probably, when we look at the institution types that DPLA hubs are working with. Everybody's working with academic libraries. Everybody's working with archives. Okay, you kind of expect these, right? Museums, public libraries. And then it starts to drop off pretty quickly here. So we see cultural heritage organizations. Not everybody, not all the hubs are working with them, but most of them are. Most of the hubs are also working with historic sites of some type. Most of them are working with educational institutions, but then a steep decline here. Only 7% are working with individuals themselves contributing content and then making it accessible through the hub network. So that's an interesting finding in this, and there's more slicing and dicing we'll look at here in a moment as well. But how those institutions become participants was also another question that we were interested in learning more about. Most of them are an application-based process. Some of them are, approval through a board meeting kind of environment. And some of those institutions come in through inquiring through a personal inquiry. So having those kind of connections. But when we look at all these different organizations, beyond the customary institution types, the only additional type that we saw mentioned in the survey respondents' answers were a theater troupe, an LGBTQ plus organization, and a government library. So most of these are more traditional organizations that the DPLA hubs are currently working with. And I'll hand it over to Greg.
Sure. This is another thing that we found very interesting. There are certain requirements to become a participant. Now, not all DPLA hubs are the same. Some DPLA hubs are aggregators only. In other words, they harvest from other sites. So the requirement of having a OAI PMH feed is something that they have, right? Yet small organizations who have their stuff in Past Perfect and things like that may not be able to meet that requirement, okay? Others, many required you to be an institution or to be a nonprofit organization or other sort of barriers that tended to favor what we are calling a customary institutions. We went all over the place about what word to use. We had traditional, we had various 3 or 4 others. We settled on customary to be the least fraught with intellectual baggage. and maybe it is, but well, we had to pick something. Some required that you have a content management system that they could pull feeds out of, right? But there are a lot of technology barriers as well as organizational barriers. And we said, well, could the hubs remove some of these requirements in order to improve the equity of the application process? These are some of the questions that came up as we looked at some of these things. How much of this is actually necessary to share content? How much of this is actually necessary? Or how much is just the way things are now? Next slide. Another thing we looked at, and this is not necessarily related to access, but in some ways it is like what services are offered by these hubs. Most hubs, of course, will provide one-on-one consultations. And that's something we do at the CTDA. We sit down and we kind of craft the experience that you're going to have to your needs. And we think this is actually a very powerful tool that we're not one size fits all. The problem is we have to get people to sit down at that table. And many times we've lost them before they sit down at the table because they can't make any sense of our website. They look in to see the members and they say, this does not look like me. All right. Many other hubs offer metadata training and metadata normalization work and things like that. All these things are good. Not all of them necessarily are common to everyone. So what services are really important when it comes to assisting newcomers, right? Once you get them to sit at the table. And if we could focus on those things, then we have a better chance of moving people through this process so they can manage their own culture and their own world themselves. Next slide.
All right. So just for a little higher level summary of some of the things that we found through the survey. Once again, to reiterate, poorly designed websites and technical language are often a barrier of entry, right? We've all been to maybe business websites where we're the customer and we're trying to figure out what do they want me to do now, right? So those kind of discoveries we did once again see in this environment as well. Hubs generally work with customary institutions, as we saw, and there's no requirement that is similar or exactly the same amongst all the hubs. So there's a variety of different approaches that each of the hubs are taking for that entry level connection with them. So this provides us an opportunity to reflect and think of not just the survey, but also ourselves at the CTDA. So what do we learn? Well, we should update our websites and use clear language without technical jargon when possible. We should alter our outreach approach in order to reach non-customary institutions. And we'll kind of follow up a little bit on that thought here in just a moment. And we should reconsider our participation requirements as well. So that's kind of looking more broadly at how do we be more inclusive in our approach.
Yes, thanks, Michael. Yeah, I want to emphasize something in that the term technical jargon is itself technical jargon, and there have been many times in the past year and a half that we have used some language and start talking to people who aren't part of the club, and they have no idea what we're talking about. And it goes back to the water in which we swim, right? We do not even notice that some of the language we use has a particular meaning to us and has a completely different meaning to someone else who is outside the club. And we have to continually remind ourselves to not to think outside the fishbowl or outside our bubble. So after looking at the DPLA hubs, then we said, all right, let's look at ourselves. Let's look at our own members. Who are we, right? How do our members define themselves? How do they see themselves? So we looked at the mission and vision statements of our members. Okay, of course, the problem, just like the DPLA hubs, members' websites were not always easily navigable. Their statements are not all public available, nor do they fully summarize an institution, right? Just because you have a mission statement doesn't mean you know everything about an institution. Many of the archives that we worked with were part of larger institutions that may have had a mission statement that differed from the archives, but at least we had a set of self-definitions and a list of values and goals. So to go on.
All right, so that leads us to a nice word cloud, right? Of taking a look at all that data and figuring out what are the commonalities that we see across all these mission vision statements, right? And taking out words like UConn, CTDA, right? Things that were not really part of the exercise, right? Community was the strongest connection across all these mission vision statements, followed by history. You can kind of see through the list of the top 20 commonly used terms. Broad, maybe not overly descriptive, right? Like probably not what you expect when you start doing this type of analysis. So looking at your own mission vision statement, one, is a nice reflective opportunity. And two, looking at other collaborators you're working with provides an opportunity to have this broader dialogue. So it's a great exercise to kind of approach from a data-informed perspective of how do we get to a more inclusive approach? Are we using language like inclusiveness? No. And then this quick summary here as an example. So the other thing that we wanted to look at is who are our members at the Connecticut Digital Archive, right? And this kind of, I think from my perspective when we started, this kind of shocks me that public libraries are the largest contingency of a group that we have here at the CTDA, followed by museums, then followed by historical societies, and archive. Well, we're kind of a customer of ourselves in a way in that kind of graphic there, but academic libraries and schools as well are in this mix. So it's just kind of interesting to see how each hub is a little different in sort of what their makeup looks like. But when we do our self-reflection internally, I didn't expect public library to be the larger group that we would be looking at almost 10 years after founding of the CTDA. So how do we analyze this data? I'm going to turn this over to Greg.
Sure. When we started looking at the organizations and their mission statements, and then started looking at the multicultural development model, and this is just one, and I don't know, there are many of these out there, but we had this idea that where do we stand on this? Because we can talk the talk, but we really need to walk the walk. And we kind of decided that the CTDA itself is still pretty monocultural, but we're trying to move into at least transitional and take committed effort to include others and tolerates the difference that those others bring. And in other words, and we'll talk about some of the positive action that we're trying to create. We have not yet made major changes in what we do, but we are on that road, and we'll talk about them again in a couple minutes. And we really want to hear your ideas about where we're going and what we think. We hope that by the time we get done, well, not done, by the time we get to our next phase, that we can actively include a diversity of people representing different styles and perspectives, including different styles and perspectives of the way you preserve and make available digital culture. And so that's really what we're going for. And here's another way to look at our members.
Right. So I'm the geographer, so I have to bring a map to the conversation. Right. So this is a distribution of where our membership looks like throughout the state of Connecticut. And so one of the questions as a geographer I bring to this is thinking a little bit about, so what about the areas where there's not a dot, right? What communities are maybe not currently in conversations with the Connecticut Digital Archive? Where's their outreach opportunity? Are their voices being heard by working with another organization across the state? So mapping out where your members are really kind of helps us see that. But then comparing this to other data that is accessible, we could look to see, is there a socioeconomic division here? Are only more wealthy towns part of the CTDA, and voices in other communities are not as well represented? So really kind of looking at those angles of data can help us kind of think moving forward about our membership and how to engage a broader range of communities.
So as you know, the CTDA is a small organization, and we did our best to ask and answer some questions for ourselves about our membership and about our colleagues. We think this experience was very valid for us and can be a guide for other repositories. But we've really identified 4 areas of activity in the next phase, and we've started to move in that direction. I want to tell you about some of the work we're doing. Next slide, please. Since we manage the technology platform and we don't manage the content in our technology platform, we understand that much of our technology and many of our practices are inherently biased, including search algorithms, metadata systems, and tools that I mentioned earlier. We really need to ensure that our technology supports multiple cultural viewpoints and intellectual structures, metadata standards and practices, search algorithms, and more. As part, the CTDA is going through a platform refresh. We're moving from an Islandora 7 platform to the new Islandora 2 platform, and we're taking that opportunity, even though preservation is not about software, we're taking that opportunity to reimagine our infrastructure so that more and more varied metadata vocabularies are automatically tied into the metadata system, that it's possible, instead of having a hierarchical organizational system, that the ability to create a relationship map is is available. All these things that allow people to interact with content. And I know now that we have Michael, who is a geographer, we're going to have some really great geographic access tools that allow people to interact with the data in ways that make more sense to them instead of ways that make sense to us. Next slide, please. Again, we are rewriting everything that connects with the public and with our own members. And we're trying to make our mission and message more understandable to the general public. Redesigning our website in language and organization. And I tell you, it is hard work. We do something and we think, oh, this is really great. We show it to somebody else and they go, what are you talking about? And we go, oh man, we got to get out of the fishbowl. Finally, the most, I think, radical idea that we've come to is that we've changed our participation requirements. You no longer have to be an organization. In fact, now all you have to do is to promise to support and have a commitment to stewardship of the content that you are contributing, not giving away, but contributing, because all CTDA members retain ownership and responsibility for their data, okay? Institutional affiliation is no longer required. And since we've changed this participation requirement, we've had a fashion designer join the CTDA. We have had a defunct art gallery, and the person who has all the records from that defunct art gallery joined the CTDA, and a number of other inquiries from what we're calling non-customary organizations. How far can we democratize access to creating primary sources, right? How much archival practice do you need to know to be able to curate your own story? We do not have the metadata police. We do not, there are only 4 required fields. 3 of them have to do with administration, like who's the owner, what kind of an object is it, and what is its file format. The other one is title. You know, what is the role of the archivist in this more democratized approach to digital preservation? And what will be the effect on the historical record, right? Can an amalgamation of community members and non-professionals put together the Tower of Babel or a coherent historical resource? We don't know the answer to that. But we're working on it. Inclusion. Okay, the CTDA has a advisory board, and guess who's on it? A bunch of middle-aged white people. We haven't been very successful recruiting alternative voices in the directorship of the CTDA, right? This is something that's on us. We need to expand the diversity of our advisory and other committees, right? Part of CTDA in context is to learn how to get introductions into those communities, because we come from the University of Connecticut, big, bad, monolithic white institution that is, yes, a land-grant college, okay, which is built on the exploitation of indigenous people. There are a couple of strikes against us there. So we have to figure out a way to do this better. I'm going to turn it over to Michael for a couple of more points of reflection, and then we'll open up to conversation.
All right, thank you, Greg. So the first point of reflection, and we welcome questions through the chat and related to this point. Hubs seem to work primarily with customary institutions, as we saw through the survey results. How can we alter our outreach strategy and change our infrastructure in order to reach other institutional types? I mean, it's a really higher level kind of thought process to percolate and think about there. So if anybody has any specific thoughts beyond what we have been talking about today, we welcome that in the chat.
This is where we continue our research and learn from you.
Thank you so much for this presentation. And beyond the question that they asked in the chat or in the slide, you can put any other questions in the chat for them. I did have a question. You mentioned you only have 4 required metadata fields. This possibly is getting into the weeds, but as a DPLA contributor, how do you handle, I didn't hear you list standardized right statements. Do you use
standardized right statements?
I was just curious because I know some
I
people
missed that one.
That's fine.
Yes. In order to participate in the DPLA, we have standardized right statements, title, file format, ownership, and some other thing. Yes, but I forgot standardized right statements. Thank you for calling me on that. We didn't require standardized right statements for the first 6 years until we joined the DPLA, and we still have a lot of records that don't yet have standardized right statements that we have to go back. We have a huge retrospective right statements project going, but now it is a requirement. If you try to ingest something without a standardized right statements, it's like you get the little red box. It says you didn't put one in.
Yeah, I understand that. Yeah, as a DPLA contributor that was entered right as they were requiring that, that's been our largest barrier, I think, for some institutions, because obviously we're not putting those in. I mean, most institutions aren't putting in standardized right statements until now as they join DPLA. I think we are getting more information out about that now.
Yeah, we have a, and I'll post it in the chat. We have a interactive what right statements should I use, a little thing on our website. And we have this big warning. This is not legal advice.
Yeah.
But
that's been the other thing is we don't add them for our most of the people on the call are probably our providers, but we've chosen that since we're not lawyers, we're not putting in your right statements for you. And Jen asks in the chat if we have any other institutions here that work with individual contributors or have in the past and no longer do. So if anybody wants to chime in with that. Oh, and here's a great question from Peter, our technology specialist. How do you handle data transfer from non-standard contributors who aren't using OI and PMH? What other data formats are you using for contributions, XML, text files? And thanks for sharing your copyright.
The CTDA is not an aggregator. Well, okay, we're not primarily an aggregator. In other words, we are a repository that provides preservation services. So if you join the CTDA, you're ingesting content into the CTDA system. So the Connecticut Historical Society doesn't have a preservation system that they share through OAI PMH. They ingest their content into the CTDA. So when it comes time to sharing it out, we've already got it. Now, we have done a couple of small pilots with other institutions to harvest their, like Wesleyan University, to harvest their data because they have their own system and they have OAI PMH. So we don't harvest metadata, we collect content. So that's sort of a little different thing. Other hubs are just metadata aggregators, right? So we provide a technology infrastructure. You can use a web-based form and there's a metadata form you type stuff in, or you can use a spreadsheet where we provide you with a spreadsheet with the column headers, and then you fill out the spreadsheet and you can ingest stuff in batches. But our primary goal is actually not aggregation, it's preservation. So we are preservation service first.
Thank you. That's a little different than here in Ohio, but that's interesting to see how everyone across the country is functioning differently for some of these DPLA hubs. And Emily, thanks for sharing that you recently digitized the personal collection of the local League of Women Voters board meeting minutes. That's really fascinating. I wanted to ask, when you're looking at geography, do you have any sort of overlays that you've been putting in on of the communities that you like were there previously or are there historically?
Come on, Michael, you've been here a whole week.
Ask me in 6 months, right? It should be the answer to that question. But I definitely have some thoughts. Let's just put it that way on how we can improve the geographic access points in the repository. Everybody uses different geographic terms, which works individually in your siloed environment, but when you bring it all together in a system, it can be challenging. So I have presented before to CTDA members to talk about sort of some intellectual exercises of when best to use more specific details like coordinates versus using geographic subject terms and place terms and things of that nature, so that you don't lead somebody down a path of thinking it's more accurate than it really is. Right. So putting a coordinate in makes me think, oh, I can drive right there. Right. And it turns out, no, it's just the center point of the town. And that didn't really help me, or the center point of the state, which is even less helpful. So, so really kind of thinking of how to balance that out and building the dialogue around that is really what I want to focus on in the next 6 to 8 months as we're doing the migration project into the new system. And it's going to bring up lots of questions for us to, as a broader community, to talk about and come up with what we think would be the best solution for that in both a localized way and then also in a broader contributing content up to DPLA. So
we are really disappointed in the library-like interface of the current CTDA and the relevance ranking model and things like that. It's not really, we think, the way a lot of people want to find stuff like this. We think a map or another, we've experimented with other graphical interfaces like, little clouds of links and things like that, that aren't a list, are not a hierarchical list. I see in the chat, Amber Bales is okay, right? I can read the chat from here.
Yeah, I was getting ready to read that, but
okay.
Go ahead.
It sounds like you want to engage more broadly with differing types of institutions and communities. Engagement with your public libraries would be a great option. They know their community well and might be able to connect you with smaller organizations that meet in their spaces. Yes, absolutely. Once we discovered that we had a lot of public libraries, and we have a couple of public library consortia in the state. Excuse me, one of them is Bibliomation, which provides like library catalog services, and we partner with them to deliver CTDA services. So they know their librarians already. And it's not like, oh, here come the Yukon people. It's like, oh, wait, here comes this person coming with my Bibliomation rep that I know and like already. And so that's kind of our in. And yes, public libraries are fabulous. They are such great connections to communities. We're working with Connecticut Humanities, which is it's a community, it's a re-granting organization in Connecticut to build. We have a project we're calling My Town, My Story, where we want to headquarter that in public libraries. And then the public libraries would invite people to come in and share their stories into the CTDA. And you would not know necessarily that the CTDA existed. You're just contributing something to your town. And that's a project that's very much in the idea stage right now, but yes.
Thank you. It looks like Marilee put a comment in the chat about a report that is from the NAFAN project looking at expanding the network of institutions that contribute archival collections to description aggregators. And this is centering around those smaller community-based institutions, and it could be helpful to think about how to inform the thinking of those institutions. So I don't know if you want to comment on that.
Thank you.
Yeah,
I have not seen this.
Yeah, that looks like a really good resource. Jen had another question in the chat, and so Many of us are working on reshaping our leadership teams. Can you expand a little bit on CTDA's plans on expanding the diversity backgrounds of your advisory board? You did mention your advisory board is pretty monolithic at this point.
Yes. Our plans is we have to go out and meet people. So the advisory board is definitely, it's not like you don't apply. We just ask people who, we think are interested. Michael was a member of our advisory board when he was out in California. You don't have to be in Connecticut. But it generally draws from the membership. So it's kind of a chicken and egg thing. So I don't know how, if any of you out there have advisory boards, it's like, right, we're kind of caught in chicken and egg. And how do we kickstart this? And not appear that we're being, oh, here's our token alternative, person, or it's really hard because there's a lot of suspicion.
Are you finding, because you said that you're more a preservation goal rather than an aggregation goal. So you said you have added some different collections, but what does that sort of recruitment look like for you? Are you going and approaching specific institutions that you think might be interested in contributing to CTDA? Are you like cold calling, or how is that working?
We have never been aggressive. And I think one of the results of never being aggressive is that word of mouth only goes so far. And so the people who joined at the beginning, who were customary institutions, told other people from customary institutions. And now we've built up an organization that it does not reflect the diversity of Connecticut. And perhaps we should have been more aggressive at the beginning. But at the beginning, we were just trying to get anybody to pay attention to this. And so we went with the easiest solutions, people who already were doing this work, people who really did need a preservation solution. So by going after sort of the easy wins, we really skewed our membership in a certain direction. So in retrospect, we probably should have done that differently. But at the time, we didn't have the funding stability that we have now. We didn't have the, oh my God, in the early days of the CTDA, if the thing ran for 3 days in a row, we were like happy. We didn't have the technology stability. We had to prove that what we did like actually worked. Yeah, so like I said, in retrospect, we could have done things much differently, but we didn't. And now here we are saying, how do we jumpstart this? So really, yeah, sorry, I don't really have a good answer.
Have you thought about ways you want to do it differently? You said you didn't like how you've done it, so or is that still in the idea stage?
I think the public library project, the My Town, My Story project, is going to be a big change. If we get funding, we've applied for funding for a 2-year project to pilot this, and we will focus on public libraries in places on the map that Michael showed you that don't have representation. And these are not just urban communities, but these are rural communities. People think like Connecticut is all like New Haven and Stamford and stuff like that. There are some really rural towns in Connecticut that don't look a lot different than they did in 1785. So we want to, if we get this funding, we will have a staff person who is focused on addressing the monoculturalness of our membership and go out and actively work to find other communities through the public libraries. So that's our plan.
Thank you. And as Jen, to echo what Jen said, it's your discussion and the power of inertia and just how hard it is to move forward. And you've been very frank about some of the things that are less comfortable to talk about today. And we really appreciate that. We've got about 4 minutes left in this session. If anyone wants to squeeze in a last minute chat, other question, I'm going to turn it over to Jen to talk about our lunch. And we do have just a reminder, that poll for those coffee chat discussions, which is another way for us to have more frank and open discussion about difficult things. And Jen has dropped a link for that in the chat. And if you could put your suggestions straight into the Jamboard, that's a great way for us to save them for later. Thank you.
Thanks, Penelope, and thank you so much, Greg Colati and Michael Howser. Once an Ohioan, always an Ohioan. We can find a way to tie literally anything back to Ohio. That's what we do, right? Here in the state. So thank you. It always pulls you back in, right? Thank you both so much for your discussion and insight into, you know, what it's like to work with digital collections and DPLA and in another region that is not Ohio, because we do all do things differently. And I find it very valuable to hear the work that's going on otherwise. So feel free to stick around for the rest of the afternoon and listen to my cats make some noise. We're going to have lunch from 12:15 until 1 p.m. And when we return, we are going to be talking with Marilee Prophet from OCLC about the Reimagine Descriptive Workflows project that she and some other folks, many other folks actually, worked on, that OCLC published a report earlier this year. We'll have some more links and some more polls that will go more smoothly this time. And we will look forward to seeing you. And of course, after that, we will have our lightning talks from our metadata mini grant recipients and the annual report from ODN staff. So thanks again to University of Connecticut.
And thank you all so much.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you all so much. We really appreciate it.
Of course, absolutely. We love to hear from both of you anytime.